Hello, I'm Francisco and this is What the Book, the show where we use literature to talk about history. Today we are hitting the classics, and by classics I mean a book that even teachers don't really assign that often anymore because Hollywood watered it down and we've kind of forgotten how awesome the book is. Not to mention how its author is a goth icon and I wish I could be half as dark and fabulous as her. I am talking about Frankenstein or The Modern Prometheus by Mary Shelley. Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin, later Mary Shelley, was born in 1797 in London and died in 1851 also in London, which means she lived through a big chunk of what we now know as the Industrial Revolution. Her life was quite tragic, with her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, a feminist writer, dying days after she was born, and later 3 of her 4 children not surviving childhood. Partly for social reasons, because industrialization and capitalism were making it seem like people didn't care about each other anymore and only cared about profits and science, but also weirdly enough because of the weather. Mary Shelley lived through a period that geologists and historians refer to as the Little Ice Age. Between about the late 14th century and the first half of the 19th century, temperatures on Earth were much colder than they are now. Rivers, including the River Thames in London, regularly froze over, and in 1815 in particular, Mount Tabora in what is now Indonesia erupted and caused global temperatures to drop half a degree Celsius. That doesn't sound like much, but it was enough to cause heavy snowstorms, floods, and the worst famine Europe saw in the 19th century, making young people like Mary Shelley, who was 18 at the time, a little darker and more bored than usual. It was in this context during a cold, dark summer holiday in Geneva, Switzerland, that Mary Shelley woke up from a nightmare and wrote a novel that is still freaking us out 200 years after it's been published and single-handedly created the genre of science fiction. The story goes, it is the 19th century and a scientist that is doing research in the North Pole has to stop for a few days because the ice has surrounded his vessel and prevented it from advancing. When his crew looks out the window, they see an unusual sight. A superhumanly tall man driving a dog sled and a normal-sized man chasing him. The normal-sized man enters the vessel, turns out to be Dr. Victor Frankenstein, and because he's dying from exposure, decides to tell them his life story. As it turns out, he is from a rich and important family in Geneva, Switzerland, so he gets to go to university in Germany, where he takes chemistry and physics classes, this is an important detail, and for some reason figures out how to bring the dead back to life. As a university student with access to the university's resources and laboratory, he makes a creature out of human parts from a graveyard, you know, as normal college students do, and brings it back to life using electricity, which wasn't super understood at the time, but he is so freaked out by what he created that he runs away, falls ill, and is nursed back to health by his best friend Clerval. When he wakes up and gets better, he gets the news that his younger brother William, who was a child, had been murdered and that Justine, the family servant that everybody loved, was guilty. He goes back to Geneva to be with his family, and while he's there, everyone knows that Justine is innocent because they just can't see her murdering a child, but the court finds her guilty, she is executed, and it is at this point that Victor Frankenstein finds the monster, and the monster tells us his story. It turns out that leaving a creature you just created by itself right after you created it is a pretty bad idea. When he woke up after being abandoned, the monster was pretty disoriented because he didn't know any language or how to experience anything around him, and when he faces people, they're super freaked out by his appearance. Because remember, he's made out of parts of dead people, and so he has no way of socializing and no way of learning how to behave until he runs into a random family in the middle of the forest. By watching them and listening to them, he figures out that the father is blind and that the son is gonna marry a Middle Eastern woman who comes live with them, who is learning French, history, and literature. And that is how the monster also learns those things. At this point, the creature finds some letters written by Victor Frankenstein in the robe that he's wearing, and they're all like,
So I made this monster and it's totally gross, so I just left it there. Bye.
And the monster is, kind of understandably, like,
Victor Frankenstein must suffer like I suffer.
which, you know, a bit extreme, but understandable considering the circumstances. Anyway, eventually the family he's been watching sees him, freaks out, rejects him, and so does pretty much everybody else he runs into. The monster is now sick of all this bull, so he decides to punish Dr. Frankenstein by going to Geneva, killing his younger brother, and framing Justine for the crime. As he tells the story to Victor Frankenstein, he also forces him to make him a companion because he's like,
If you made me like this and I have to be alone because of it, You have to make someone else so they'll be alone with me.
At first, Frankenstein refuses,
That is gross. No.
but he really wants the monster to leave his family alone. So he goes far away to a university in Scotland and starts creating a female creature like the monster. But again, he gets so freaked out and disgusted by his own work that he kills the new creature before it's completed. And when the monster finds out, he is, again, kind of understandably like,
I kill what you love, and then I kill you, Victor Frankenstein.
and he does. He kills Frankenstein's best friend Clerval, he kills his wife on his wedding night, and then his father dies of old age, so now Frankenstein has no one. This is when Frankenstein himself decides that the monster needs to be punished and starts chasing him all over the world. However, the monster has superhuman strength and never gets tired, so that is how they end up in the North Pole, with Frankenstein pretty much dying in the process. As Victor Frankenstein finishes telling the story to the ship's crew, he dies, and the monster comes aboard to say his last goodbye. He tells the crew that he didn't mean to be bad, he just didn't know how to react to a world he didn't ask to come into, and that just didn't want him. The scientific crew then goes back home without completing their mission, partly because they're freaked out by the story of Dr. Frankenstein and the monster, but also because the moral of the story is quite explicit at the end of the novel. Advancing science is not worth sacrificing your life or the lives of your loved ones. And now the cool part, some historical themes in Frankenstein. The first is technology and science in the Industrial Revolution. Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, lived around the final stages of the first Industrial Revolution and the beginning of the second Industrial Revolution. At this point, the revolution is more about scientists still discovering things and figuring out how to use them for money. But it's gradually changing into regular people having access to these innovations, for example, electricity, in their daily lives. Science is becoming super important for people's lives for this reason. Or, how Victor Frankenstein explains it, in other studies, you go as far as others have gone before you, and there is nothing more to know. But in a scientific pursuit, there is continual food for discovery and wonder. And sure, on one hand, it's really cool stuff. In the beginning of the book, Victor Frankenstein is really excited to learn new things, go to university, figure out ways in which science and technology can make people's lives better. He describes his own excitement like this: "It was the secrets of heaven and earth that I desired to learn. And whether it was the outward substance of things or the inner spirit of nature and the mysterious soul of man that occupied me, still, my inquiries were directed to the metaphysical, or in its highest sense, the physical secrets of the world." One of the main consequences of the Industrial Revolution was the feeling people had of finally being able to control their own destiny by understanding and controlling nature. Where their ancestors would have seen just a field, people living through industrialization saw potential, opportunity to raise crops and feed a lot of people. Where older generations saw illness and death, people now saw medical advancements, cures, medicine, the possibility of not only curing the sick but maybe living forever. This kind of hope for the future was a new thing in Europe and North America, where people were still grappling with things like social class, war, famine, illness, which leads us to our second historical theme: Romanticism as a response to industrialization and capitalism. Sure, the Industrial Revolution was a really hopeful time, but it was also a scary time for people there. Just like scientists were figuring out how to control nature for humanity's benefit, they were also figuring out that doing exactly that was probably a lot more difficult and dangerous than it looked. And not only that, but industrialization and capitalism had some very real negative consequences for people's lives. Everyone, adults and children, now had to work their entire lives for other people who were getting richer just so they wouldn't starve. If they got sick, not only was there the issue of like, maybe you'll die, there was also some false hope being given to them by early medicine, which wasn't that great, and in reality actually made it worse for people who thought they would get better and then just didn't. Relationships were changing, feelings were disappearing because people needed to be practical to think about money. And all for what? To have more steam engines? Romanticism was an artistic movement that emphasized the beauty in nature and the human condition, which they saw as being lost in the face of all this technology and so-called progress. Frankenstein is a romantic novel in the sense that it looks at all the technological advancement around it. I mean, Dr. Frankenstein created a new person using technology. It freaks out and basically asks, where is it all going? What's the point of all this? And believe it or not, the main romantic figure in the novel is the monster. For one, we know he found and read 3 books while he was hiding in the forest, which all happen to be romantic classics. Paradise Lost, which is an epic poem about how Adam and Eve lost their innocence, started disobeying God, and now everything is awful.
Anyone looking for the paradise lost? 달콤한 꿀처럼 좋은 건 말이야.
The Sorrows of Young Werther, which is about a young man in Industrial Revolution Germany who finds himself in a love triangle, but in a society that doesn't really care about feelings or love, so he commits suicide in the end.
And if you're listening to this tape, you're one of the reasons why.
And Plutarch's Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, which is basically a Gossip Girl blog from the 2nd century AD, where Plutarch basically wonders if anyone in the Greek and Roman high class is actually a good person.
Good morning, Upper East Siders. Gossip Girl here. Your one and only source into the scandalous lives of Manhattan's elite.
If those were the books he read, it becomes pretty clear why he was not cool with finding the letters where Frankenstein basically says he doesn't care about him. It's also not surprising that the monster identifies first with Adam from the Bible, because he was brought into the world without being asked for permission and then kind of had to figure things out on his own when his father, God, abandons him, and Werther from the Sorrows of Young Werther, because he has feelings and just a lot to offer and people don't want it. He is intelligent and he has true human feelings, especially for Victor Frankenstein, who he sees as his father, but because of his appearance, people literally don't want anything to do with him. From the monster perspective, he is a real person, but society only cares about his appearance, which admittedly is quite horrifying. Victor Frankenstein actually describes him like this: his yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness, but those luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes, that seemed almost of the same color as the dun-white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight black lips. I mean, this is an individual made out of dead people by a lazy college student, so he was not gonna be a masterpiece. When the monster finds out about the existence of Victor Frankenstein, he expects a father, but what he gets is a superficial coward who wants nothing to do with him. Basically, their relationship could be described as the song Grace Kelly by Micah. And finally, a third theme, 19th century Switzerland. Another consequence of the Industrial Revolution was that governments, especially liberal ones, were now forced to at least give the impression that their workings were rational, made sense, and were not based on random beliefs or social classes. Governments now had to justify their decisions with real evidence, not just,
Well, God wants it that way.
Victor Frankenstein is quick to point this out about his family's treatment of their servant Justine. The Republican institutions of our country have produced simpler and happier manners than those which prevail in the great monarchies that surround it. Hence, there is less distinction between the several classes of its inhabitants, and the lower orders, being neither so poor nor so despised, their manners are more refined and moral. A servant in Geneva does not mean the same thing as a servant in France and England. Justine, thus received in our family, learned the duties of a servant, a condition which, in our fortunate country, does not include the idea of ignorance and the sacrifice of the dignity of a human being. While this made some people extremely hopeful, especially in systems where everybody was supposed to be equal, like republics in the United States and Switzerland, romantics were quick to point out that not everything was perfect. In the book, the monster kills Frankenstein's younger brother and very easily pins the crime on Justine by faking one piece of evidence, which, unluckily for her, was enough for the Swiss justice system to find her guilty and have her executed. People were very hopeful about the system being able to work for Justine. For example, Frankenstein's father says, "If she is, as you believe, innocent, rely on the justice of our laws, and the activity with which I shall prevent the slightest shadow of partiality." But it wasn't perfect, even though literally everybody knew that Justine was innocent because they just couldn't see her killing a child that she grew up with. The system was flawed and she was unfairly executed. And this is another example of the main idea of the story, that rational ideas, even though they are rational, have moral implications. It is possible for something to make perfect sense and be morally reprehensible. In the end, if we're being realistic, both Victor Frankenstein and the monster got exactly what they wanted, and that destroyed them to the deepest levels. Frankenstein got to create life with his own hands by using science, and that life ended up killing him and everybody he loved. And the monster also got what he wanted. He got to see Frankenstein die, but then he only lived to regret it. Like the monster says at the end of the novel,
"Oh, Frankenstein, generous and self-devoted being, what does it avail that I now ask thee to pardon me? I, who irretrievably destroyed all thou loved. Alice, he is cold. He cannot answer me."
Anyway, the book is great, read it if you can, and remember, we all have some light and some darkness within us. Back when I was teaching, my students read this book for class and helped me write this script. Thanks guys. I hope you learned something. See you next time.